Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Many thanks for taking the time today. My name is Rob Griffin. I am CEO of MIRACL. So today, as part of the payments and compliance track at SBC Summit in Barcelona, we are going to be discussing the subject of online authentication. Online gaming operators really face a growing requirement in terms of compliance, fraud and security that places big demands on the user authentication methodology that they deploy. Today we're going to be exploring how authentication via passwords, which are really the default system for user authentication, how that system may be failing the industry, what are the possible impacts on operators, and what could be done to address any shortcomings. So before we do that, I'd just like to give you a quick intro on MIRACL so you can understand our perspective and background. Okay, so MIRACL offers simple and secure authentication of both login and transactions for any user-centric company by replacing passwords, expensive SMS text messages, or complex two-factor authentication. And in essence, what we're doing is helping these customers enhance and secure the online experience for their users. Our customers really include global consumer-facing brands, banks, fintech giants, and even a military operation like the US Air Force. But you can see the logos on the screen. We've signed our first few gaming customers, and we're about to go live with a real global leader in the gambling space. So no doubt in a few months' time, you'll see their logo added to our rostrum. It's important to understand that MIRACL really is a deep tech company. We have 12 awarded patents, and we really work very hard to have that technology realize the following: not only to improve security, but crucially to also improve the user's experience. The reality is that without a good user experience, you won't get sales, particularly in an industry like gaming and gambling, which is designed to be, basically entertainment. So if you can't give people a good user experience, you won't get sales. And while security is really important, it's basically pretty worthless if you don't have sales. So that's really how we set ourselves apart. So with that, I'd like to return to the agenda to today and talk about the issues around passwords. And to make things interesting, I'm going to make three promises. The first is that right now passwords are costing you as an operator revenue right now. Secondly, they're risking a huge amount of cost that you might have incurred as a result of some of their shortcomings and security issues. And we'll examine those. And thirdly, we need to look at the alternative to passwords. And we'll show you some of those and take a look at what we believe is a complete solution. So I mentioned that passwords are actually costing you revenue. Well, why would that be? Fundamentally, it's because users hate them, as you can see in the slide. Why do they hate them? Well, ultimately, they're asked to remember 150 different passwords. It's basically mission impossible. And so the result of that is that actually within a 3-month period, 78% of users end up forgetting their password and having to reset. That takes a huge, that creates a big problem for two reasons. First of all, it's an opportunity for consumers to just basically go elsewhere. They can't get into their service. Are they going to go into reset password mode, or are they just going to go and open up a new account? It's a big issue. The second is that actually it's a security issue. How can you be sure that the person wanting to reset the password is indeed the authorized customer for which you've done a KYC? So the really important point, though, is the fact that passwords are the number 2 reason why bets don't get placed. People get frustrated because they can't remember, and time passes, they've missed the opportunity to place a bet. Well, what does that really mean? It means lost revenue, which brings me to my first promise, and we'll tick that one off. Perhaps more importantly, there's the element of risk, because it's such a huge potential downside. And we talked about the costs that passwords are actually incurring on gaming operators. So why is that? Well, it's primarily because of hackers. Hackers simply love passwords. What we're seeing right now is that 43% of attempted logins into gaming and gambling services are fraudulent. So how's that come about? Well, fundamentally, it's because there are 15 billion usernames and passwords, what we call credentials, sat on the dark web that have essentially been gathered from numerous previous breaches, large breaches that you will have no doubt read about in the press, whether it be Yahoo or LinkedIn or Facebook. And those credentials have been amassed and packaged up and resold. And those are very, very valuable because consumers, given that they have to remember 150 passwords, are reusing their passwords with enormous regularity. In fact, 70% of users reuse their password. What that means is, therefore, that if you purchase the username and password for, I don't know, rob.griffin@yahoo.com, there's a good chance that rob.griffin, not in this case, but will have the same password on his Facebook account or on his gaming and gambling account. And this creates a massive problem. So those credentials are loaded up into purpose-built servers that are essentially firing authentication requests at gaming and gambling operations at the rate of 100 per second, which is why you end up with a very large proportion of the total traffic being fraudulent. Moreover, this problem has actually got worse as a result of COVID-19. You've seen over a 400% increase in the last 6 months in phishing attacks, which are really just another means by which you can harvest a user's credentials. So this is a problem that is getting markedly worse. And what you have to appreciate is that it affects everything else. Because if you cannot actually be sure who is accessing your service, you can't then carry out good regulatory compliance. And with that, you're going to be subject to fines. Safer gambling is impossible because you don't in truth know the user, and compliance adherence is going to be very difficult without the user's ID. It's essentially the same as building a compliance castle on sand. You just simply don't know who the identity of the user is. So fines are undoubtedly the number one risk for gaming and gambling operators right now as a result of this problem. And you've no doubt seen some of the high awards that have been granted. And I don't propose to go through them now. In addition to fines, you also have the element of fraud. On average, it takes €250 of compensation for gaming, gambling, banking customers that have had their accounts taken over. And that results in, first of all, the upfront cash to the user, but then secondly, 8 hours on average of forensics trying to understand how the account takeover took place and basically working out what happened. That's again a huge cost. And then finally, there's the element of customer churn. Clearly, if a customer is hacked, they're going to be pretty unhappy about it. And what you find is 84% of customers then leave. So this has disastrous ramifications for your customer lifetime value, and it's a huge cost to the business. So all of these result in increased costs, which leads us to say that password risks are really resulting in millions of potential costs, millions in euros of potential costs to gaming operators, which brings me to my second promise, which we'll tick off. So the reality is, yes, there have been a big increase in some of these problems, and no doubt the fines have rapidly increased. Fraud has grown at over 50% per annum in some instances. But we've actually known for some time that passwords really don't work that well. So why do they still exist? Well, I think that's a fairly important question when analyzing what might replace them. So there are 3 real issues. The first is that passwords are actually familiar to everyone. We may not like or we may not appreciate the task of trying to remember the password, but the reality is we understand how it works. They're relatively simple and they're inclusive. They work on every device. People sort of get them. They don't have to figure it out. The second is they're cheap to run. They're certainly not cheap in a total cost of ownership sense because of the fraud and fines issue that I mentioned previously, but they are low cost. The third issue is that they're actually relatively easy to deploy. You're not going to cause your tech team big problems and headaches if they are asked to implement a username and password. So I bring this up because it's really fundamental in looking at the the requirements of alternatives to passwords. They've got to adhere to these three criteria. Otherwise, they're not really going to work. So what are the alternatives? Well, first off is SMS two-factor authentication. This represents around about 60% of the two-factor authentication market. The good thing with there is that there's no really large upfront license cost. The fact is that you're paying as you go. You pay as and when a user needs to access your service. However, what you're paying is an awful lot. A text message may be 3, 4, sometimes even 5 pence, and international ones can be more. And yes, you can bring that down to 1.5 pence depending on your volume, but in a high frequency service like gaming and gambling, that still amounts to a lot of money. And particularly mid high intense sessions such as mid-match. Perhaps even more importantly, there's a huge fall off in sales conversion because it's a two-step process. I put in my username and password, which still exists by the way. I then go to get my mobile, wait for the text message, make sure I have reception, get the 6-digit code, enter that into the app. In all that process, there's a lot of friction, and by that time, in a impulse-led purchase such as gaming and gambling, the moment may have passed. Finally, there's a real security issue. SMSs are using what's called SS7 as the kind of systems protocol, and it's subject to SIM cloning and hacking. It's basically a trust-based system. It really can't be considered secure. The second methodology is behavioral. This really revolves around identifying patterns of a given user's behavior in terms of where they typically log in from, at what time of day, with what device, what territories, and then making a set of assumptions based upon those probabilistic measurements that it is indeed the user. It's great from the point of view of low friction because it sort of happens in the background, but it really doesn't work sometimes because users change their habits. And then you'll find that actually, for whatever reason, they are traveling or they, having a late night, they want to access the service, and you end up in a situation where they authenticate into this service, but they can't actually get access. They get declined, a false decline. This is incredibly frustrating for users, and you're seeing drop-off of users when they experience that. It's also an expensive system, by the way, so there's a real cost issue there too. Next up would be authenticator apps, things like Google Authenticate. So these have the advantage of really having very little cost up front, but there's a really big problem in the fact that they are requiring a change in consumers' behavior. If I want to visit my gaming and gambling app, why would I go to Google Authenticator app first? It just takes time to change consumer behavior, so that's not easy. Also, these are two-step processes again, and some of the time we're seeing 25, 30, even 50% drop-off, and in extreme instances where SMS messages are used, 75% drop-off from that conversion process. And actually here as well there's an issue with just configuring the service. Users tend to think that actually it's the operator's responsibility, and that's what GDPR says, and that really they don't need to worry about security, hence their reuse of passwords, because they know that if their accounts get hacked, the reality is the operator will compensate them. So why should they go to the effort of actually configuring a third-party app to work with their service? Very often they just won't invest that time. It's just not compelling enough to them. The last option is a physical hardware dongle. These are secure systems, but the reality is they're highly expensive and they give you a relatively poor user experience because you've always got to have the piece of hardware in your pocket. Are you going to have that all the time? We've all got enough devices on us. It's a kind of pain to be taking around another device. So at this point, I'd like to just give you a quick demo of MIRACL and show you why we believe that we developed a compelling alternative.
Hi, I'm Michael Tanaka, the Chief Commercial Officer from MIRACL. And I'd like to show you how you can replace your passwords using MIRACL's single-step multi-factor authentication. So why is a single step so important? because every step reduces your conversion by 10 to 30%, and a failed step, like a missing SMS text, can reduce your conversion by up to 75%. So every single step represents lost business. In the first example, I'll launch a native mobile app where I'm presented with a PIN pad and I type in my PIN. And I'm straight in. An incredibly quick and easy process which is familiar to any person of any age. And the most incredible part about the technology is that it's completely impervious to all remote attacks like phishing, man-in-the-middle, replay, and all bot attacks like credential stuffing and password spraying. In fact, around 99.9% of all attacks. Even better is the fact that it doesn't rely on the security features of the phone, so it'll run on any smartphone, even phones that are many generations old. But I showed you the integration to a native app, and as we all know, native apps have to be optimized for iOS and Android. So let's try using a mobile browser to make my login completely hardware independent. So in this case, I'll click a link, and at my login, I'm asked to enter a PIN. And now with that login, I've severed all ties to the hardware. So there's absolutely nothing keeping me from logging into my desktop, but without a mobile. So let's turn the mobile off. And I'm asked to type in my PIN again. And it's as simple as that. No need for a mobile or a second step like an SMS text or an authenticator app. So I've given you a teaser of a multi-factor authentication which is easier to use than passwords. But if you want to understand how it works or how it can be deployed on any device such as a computer, mobile, smart TV or set-top box, or even an embedded device, then visit us at MIRACL booth PC5. Thank you for your time, and I hope to hear from you soon.
Great. So I just thought it was worth having shown you that demo to walk you through some of the benefits that we see of our system, and maybe that'll give you a good way of kind of gauging other alternatives. So first off, we spoke about the way in which passwords are currently costing you revenue. So we need to look at how the user experience of MIRACL offers a better monetization. Well, we say that the most important thing is to provide a secure form of authentication in a very slick way. Ours is the only system that provides a multi-factor authentication in one single input on any device. There is no other system that can do that. That's really crucial because it just means you get that higher sales conversion. Well, we say any device, and that's what we mean. It could be a smart TV, it could be any browser, it could be a set-top box, it could be an old mobile. It really doesn't matter. It's fully inclusive, and you'll recall that was one of the criteria of usernames and passwords. And then finally, it's biometric compatible. Biometrics are growing in different rates in different geographies, but it is clearly an important capability to include, although less so for laptops and desktops, obviously. So secondly, we mentioned the whole idea of fines and the costs that were resulting from there. Well, the reality is that we enable safer gambling and we enable compliance because we can give you an assurance that you are actually being accessed by your authorized device and the user that you have made your customer after a KYC. And importantly, we preserve that KYC. Very often what happens is a KYC is carried out after you've paid your 50 pence or a pound, and then a username and password is created. In truth, at that point, sort of all bets are off as to who's actually using that username and password. And so you've diminished the value of your KYC. Well, we're able to preserve that value. And then finally, it's really important to mention GDPR costs. We've obviously focused on the gambling commission costs, but GDPR is now sizable. You've seen some of the near 9-figure penalties that have been awarded against British Airways and Marriott hotels. One of the key components of the MIRACL technology is that we don't actually have an authentication database. So there is no focal point for hackers to target in order to obtain all these valuable credentials. They just simply don't exist anywhere. We do not have that database. So this is a really important point, and needs to be borne in mind in terms of the risk going forward. We talked about fraud. Well, the reality is we're preventing account takeover, and there's a lot of stats on this. Our system and multi-factor authentication in general can really save 99.99% of account takeover. And that's also, we're able to actually bind a given bet to a player and cryptographically sign that that's what they undertook. So we can provide you more information on that. And then it's really just as intuitive as a chip and pin. And that's what we're all about, bringing effectively the offline world that we're all familiar with to the online world. So lastly, we cut that churn, which is just so important in terms of customer lifetime value. Why? Because we're improving the user's experience. We're making sure that their account's not hacked. And finally, we're actually assisting operators in tracking a given user identity across multiple titles within their whole gambling estate. So I've mentioned the whole idea of driving revenues, but then also saving costs, cutting fines, fraud, and churn. Well, we do all of this just for the cost of a cent. So it's remarkably low cost, and the same kind of model as an SMS text message. No payments up front, pay as you go, but a lot cheaper than an SMS. So we say this means that we kind of qualify for the third promise. We really do believe this is a kind of optimal solution. So let's just briefly recap. We talked about the three promises, the fact that users get so irate that they can't access their service, and that loses you revenue. You miss bets as a result of that. Secondly, we mentioned the whole idea of usernames and passwords really causing cost. And this is as a result of hackers' activities. They love it, but it creates doubt as to actually who is on the service. You bear in mind those 15 billion credentials on databases. And then finally, we mentioned the complete solution in our view, which is MIRACL. So with that, I'm very grateful for your time and attention today. We really do invite you to come over to our booth in the Payments and Compliance Zone, PC5. There you can get some more information, but by all means, drop me a line, and we look forward to discussing further. Thank you very much indeed. Bye now.